So in this video, we're still looking at operations with complex numbers, and we're going to look at multiplication. Let me write this up here, operations with complex numbers, and we're going to look at multiplication. In the previous video, we looked at division and subtraction. Addition and subtraction, so now we're going to look at multiplication. So once again, our complex number is a number that is written in this form, a plus bi, sometimes you'll see it c plus di, and so on, where a, b, c, and d are real numbers and I is imaginary. Now remember, I is equal to the square root of -1. Now, along with that, if I is equal to the square root of -1, we also know that I times I equals square root of -1 times square root of -1, which equals -1. So I squared is equal to -1. And we need to keep these two ideas in our minds, because we're going to use that when we multiply complex numbers, because you're going to be multiplying an I and an I. So let's do an example. So let's start with the first example. Let's get right into it. Let's say I have 4 minus 3i, and we'll actually multiply that by 5. So you're going to follow the same properties you do algebraically when you're multiplying. You're just going to treat the I as a variable. So 5 times 4 is 20. We're going to distribute. 5 times -3i is -15i. And you're done. That's simple multiplication. So if I move on and do another example, what if I had -2 times 5 minus 4i? Let's just do that. Once again, I'm going to use the distributive property. -2 times 5 is -10. -2 times -4i, negative times a negative becomes positive, is +8i. And you're done. So that's simple distribution with a constant in front. Now, what if I put an imaginary number in the front? So let's do a second set of examples here. What color do I want to use? So I'm going to do a second set of examples here. What if I put -3i and then 2 plus 2i? I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to distribute. -3i times 2 is -6i. But what's -3i times 2i? We'll treat the I like a variable. So I have -3 times 2, which gives me -6. But then I have I times I, which is I squared. Now let's move back over to what we did initially. If I can find my cursor anywhere, it's completely disappeared, which is awesome. So if I look over here, I have I squared and I have I. I squared is equal to -1, and you can see that right here. So I can come down here to this I squared, and I can plug in -1 for I squared. So I'm going to throw a -1 in there. Now, as I go through and solve this, I've got -6i, and I have a -6 times a -1, so that's +6. And then I want to write this properly with a plus bi. So I'm just going to write this 6 minus 6i. Again, I'm just using the distributive property. So let's move up a little bit. Let's do another example. Let's say I've got 4i times 5 plus, oops, that's not a plus sign, that's a mess. 5 plus 3i. So I'm going to follow the same steps. I'm going to distribute. So I have 4i times 5, which gives me 20i. And then I have 4i times 3i, which gives me 12i squared. Okay. And 12i squared, what can we plug in for I squared? Well, now I have 20i plus 12 times I squared, which is -1. So that gives me 20i minus 12. And then I'm running out of room here. I'm going to rewrite it as negative 12 plus 20i. I'm just writing it in complex form. So that's simple multiplication using the distributive property. And you've used that before. But what if we have something a little bit more complicated? So now I'm going to give you binomial terms. So I have 3 minus 2i times 5 plus 6i. Well, you notice there's no symbol in between. This is not addition, it's not subtraction, it's multiplication. So I'm going to use distribution again. You guys may call it FOIL, but it is distribution. I'm going to take the 3 and I'm going to multiply it. Where's my undo button, which is not showing up? And I'm going to multiply it times 5. So 3 times 5 is 15. And then I'm going to take the 3 and I'm going to multiply it by 6i, which gives me 18i. Again, treat the I just like you would a variable. Now I'm going to take the negative 2i and multiply it by 5. That gives me negative 10i. And I'm going to take the negative 2i and multiply it by 6i. Well, negative 2 times 6 is negative 12, and I times I is I squared. So for my next step, I'm going to combine my like terms, the 18i and the 10i. So I have 15, and then 18i minus 10i is 8i. And then I have minus 12i squared. Well, what is I squared? I squared is negative 1. So negative 12 times negative 1 is positive 12. Now I can combine my 12 and my 15 to get 27. And then I have my 8i. So when you multiply the binomials together, you're going to get a complex number. They're binomial terms because they're 2 terms each. And we did this a lot when we did FOIL or distribution, whatever you want to call it. FOIL is a form of distribution. So let's try another example. I'll give you one more example of multiplication. And I'm going to do division in a separate video with the conjugates so that you kind of see all those terms together. So we're just going to finish up here with multiplication. So let's say, let's say I have something like this. Let's get a little complicated. Let's say I have negative 2 times 4 plus 2i times negative 5 minus 3i. Well, I'm still going to follow the FOIL aspect first. The negative 2 is just going to stay there for right now. So I'm going to do my distribution. I'm going to multiply 4 times negative 5. And I'm going to write this one below just to make things simpler. So 4 times negative 5 gives me negative 20. 4 times negative 3i gives me negative 12i. And then I'm going to go to my 2i. 2i times negative 5 gives me negative 10i. And negative 2i times negative 3i, negative times negative is positive, gives me positive 6i squared. Now remember, all of that is still multiplied by negative 2, just like you would do in regular operations. So let's simplify what's inside. I have negative 12i and negative 10i. I can change that to negative 22i because I have negative 12, take away 10 more, plus I have 6i squared. Now again, what is I squared? I squared is negative 1. So what is 6 times negative 1? It is negative 6. So I'm going to go ahead and make that a subtraction. So minus 6. And all of that is still multiplied by negative 2. But I need to simplify this a little bit more. So I have negative 20 and negative 6 that can go together. So I have negative 26 minus 22i on the inside, and I still have my negative 2 on the outside. So now I'm going to do a distribution with the negative 2. So I'm going to take negative 2, multiply it by negative 26, and I get positive 52. And then negative 2 times negative 22, I get positive 44i I. Now you're done. So that's how you do multiplication of complex numbers. And just to kind of remind you, because I know you'll see it on the assignment, remember when you take, this is just an FYI over here, when you take the square root of a number and multiply it by itself, you get that number. Remember we talked about inverses. Squaring and square rooting are inverses of each other. So when I square a square root of something, I just get that number. Think about tying your shoes and untying your shoes. I untie my shoes to take the square root. To get back to 2, I tie my shoes again. And now I'm at 2. So you'll see that sometimes. What if I have negative 14, square root of negative 14 times the square root of negative 14? Well, what can I break the square root of negative 14 into? Well, I can make it a square root of, I can make it a square root of negative 1 times square root of 14 times square root of negative 1 times square root of 14. Well, the square root of negative 1s, these are i's. What's I times I? What's I squared? Negative 1. What's the square root of 14 times the square root of 14? 14. So what's the square root of negative 14 times the square root of negative 14? Negative 14. So just remember your product rule with your radicals.